Hi everyone, welcome back to the exciting conclusion of the life of Sir Edmund Backhouse, 2nd Baronet. I thought we'd finish his life in two parts, but this one went into double overtime. In October 1932, Backhouse and Bland resumed their correspondence after a long period of silence, caused in part by Morrison's obsession to hold and control Backhouse all to himself and to destroy the relationship with Backhouse and Bland. That they collaborated on those two books was a real insult to Morrison. So Backhouse and Bland hadn't talked for years. But now Backhouse and Bland were again corresponding. Backhouse mentioned to Bland that these days he, quote, had gone native by wearing Chinese dress, as is my habit now. I am able to go about with delightful freedom and in company with Chinese friends to pass as an indigene, unquote. Backhouse had gone native in 1921 and showed up in London wearing traditional Chinese dress and a flowing white beard. He was quite a sight to behold. The main thing that Backhouse was interested to talk to Bland about was the matter of Li Lianying's diary. I mentioned him in part one. Li Lianying is the most famous eunuch of all time and perhaps was the richest. He was part of Cixi's team, serving her as Grand Eunuch, and along with Ronglu, one of the most powerful and influential men in China. When people ask, how did Cixi stay in power for so long? It was with the help of people she trusted, like this guy. In Backhouse and Bland's Cixi book, Li Lianying was the worst of the villains at the Manchu court. And ever since 1915, Backhouse had mentioned in roundabout ways that through a relative of the Grand Eunuch, he had access to the diary of Li Lianying. This was too good to be true, but the thought was quite intriguing to Bland. To have found the diary of a mid-range court official like Jing Shan was astounding in itself. But the diary of Li Lianying? This was too good to be true. To a sinologist like Bland, he knew what the value would be to the understanding of Qing dynasty history, especially during the period from 1861 to 1908. Bland knew Backhouse was a total rascal, but despite all the bitterness of the past, Bland was interested to collaborate with Backhouse one last time on this Li Lianying diary. Well, Bland should have known better. If there ever was a Li Lianying diary, Backhouse sure didn't have it. Backhouse kept jerking Bland's chain, and every time Bland asked to see some excerpts, Backhouse would exhibit the usual bizarre behavior and give the same well-worn excuses. They were both feeling vindicated from Dutch sinologist J.J.L. Duivendijk's paper that declared the Jingshan diary authentic. Despite the great victory of Duivendijk's declaration that the Jingshan diary was not the forgery others purported it was, attacks still continued. But Bland fought anyone who challenged the authenticity that he had practically built his reputation on. Then 1936 rolled around and Bland's luck ran out. There was this British journalist named William Lewison. He was a China scholar and edited a newspaper in Shanghai. Why he saw certain things that all the experts didn't, it's hard to say. He pointed out a number of things out to Bland and to Duivendijk, who, of course, exploded and replied most forcefully to Lewison, threatening with legal action and threats. Bland was probably thinking, when is this ever going to end about this Jingshan diary? As Hugh Trevor Roper said, quote, but Lewison was not to be deterred. He went ahead and published his findings in the form of an article in the learned press. In this article, he showed, by careful internal analysis, that the diary could not have been written as a diary, that it could not be the genuine work of one man, and that it could not have been written by Jingshan. He showed that it was, to some extent, a pastiche, for it incorporated verbatim passages from the contemporary published account by the Grand Secretary Wang Wenshao. Lewison had deconstructed the diary one piece at a time and then printed his findings and sent copies to Bland and Backhouse for comment. Bland panicked at once. He had dodged every bullet up till now, but this one was practically a smoking gun. There was only one person left who could defend against these attacks. That was Edmund Backhouse. It had been more than a quarter century since Morrison first cast doubt about the authenticity of this Jingshan diary. Despite a regular barrage of missiles, Bland's ship never sank. Now he was sinking, and only Backhouse could possibly save the day. Backhouse gave the same story he always gave about finding the diary 3 days after Jingshan was killed, how he translated it. Everything was real, as it was. He denied all the allegations. That wasn't much help. The specific issues were not addressed. It was worse than not answering at all. The difference between now, in 1936, and way back when the Cixi book first came out was that everyone knew about Backhouse and his dealings with the Bodleian, Brown and Company, Pauling and Company, the American Banknote Company, and everyone else who got burned along the way. Way back when, Backhouse was able to hide behind his aristocratic upbringing, his scholarship, and apparent respectability. Now, all these years later, his reputation always preceded him. All the stories were well known, so when Lewison announced his findings, taken in the context of what everyone knew about Backhouse after all these years, this made total sense that this diary, used as the primary source to write the two books, was indeed fabricated by Backhouse. So, 1936 was a terrible year, and after years of sustaining damage, the diary of Jingshan, discovered on August 18, 1900, was finally sunk by a single torpedo. So Bland got walloped with a left and right hook, first by getting misled and having his time wasted over the Li Lianying diary, and now, after a quarter century, Bland faced the bitter truth that Backhouse had used his incredible scholarship to fabricate this diary, cleverly hide it for all these years, and then pass it off as true. Not only had Bland defended himself all these years, but he aggressively attacked some detractors. Imagine how he felt now. Divendeck, too. He had declared the diary authentic and fought hand in hand with Bland when other sinologists challenged the authenticity. He, too, after trying in vain to at least put a fig leaf on his reputation, had to say in 1937 he was wrong. Everyone had clung to the hope that all these unpublished fragments of the diary that Backhouse all these years claimed to have would be produced for all to see. If there was maybe, possibly one single thing that might salvage this entire debacle, it would have been the documents Backhouse said he had found. But when he said, oops, they all got burned in a fire, everyone at this point just threw up their hands and said, "Feh." Someone visited Backhouse around this time and had this to say, quote, "Sir Edmund received me in the garden which he occupied in the western city of Peking. He was a man of great charm, tall and spare, bearded like Tolstoy, whom in his youth, as he told me, he had visited in Yasnia Polyana. In his hand he held a glass of whiskey, which his doctor had prescribed to raise his blood pressure. As to the boring old question of the diary, he had nothing to add to the narrative, which he had already sent. Backhouse said, quote, 'The facts are as I have stated. The document was found as I have written. The whole of my narrative is a cold, hard statement of fact.'" Unquote. Well, scholars of today pretty much all say this diary is a forgery, but man, the books produced from the diary are great reading, so go track them down. Google Books has them both free. China Under the Empress Dowager, being the history of the life of Cixi, compiled from the state papers and the private diary of the comptroller of her household. J.O.P. Bland and E. Backhouse. Case closed. Morrison, rest in peace, was right all along. So in 1937, as the Japanese started their invasion following the Marco Polo Bridge incident on 7/7, Backhouse was 64 years old. He seemed to always live in a state of terror, abused and taken advantage of by his servants. Chang Ho Chai, the one in particular that lorded over Backhouse, was murdered by another servant who took his place. He was not in particularly good health. Backhouse, if he went out at all, never mixed with Europeans. People rarely saw him, and if he was seen, it was sort of something you'd tell somebody. Ever since 1921, when he showed up in England looking like Matteo Ricci in Chinese dress, he had completely adopted a Chinese lifestyle, including with his appearance. After so many years, he was a well-known Beijing character. Backhouse always lived outside the legation quarter, first in the Tartar city, and then in April 1937, just before the Marco Polo Bridge incident, he moved to the western city. enjoying what couldn't have been a bad existence in a beautiful garden house. Like I mentioned before, he didn't mix with Westerners and avoided Western officials like the plague. But on those occasions where he couldn't avoid someone, if someone said hello to him, he'd transition instantly into the most genteel, charming, and polite Victorian gentleman you ever saw. People were just drawn to him. In August 1939, the Sino-Japanese War was raging in all the cities. Foreigners fled to the turnstiles, and Backhouse was advised to get out. He decided to stay in Beijing and tough it out. When the battle reached his street, he casually walked away from his residence, and afterward it was burned down in the fighting. Backhouse hadn't tried to save anything, and all his papers, his library, all his possessions were gone. Backhouse ended up shacking up at the Austrian legation, which Trevor Roper described as, quote, a convenient hostel for miscellaneous fugitives, unquote. Backhouse's publisher ran into him around this time and was quoted saying, quote, Backhouse I saw the other day in the compound of the ex-Austrian legation where he has moved to, fleeing from his house in the West City as his servants turned anti-British, so he says. He seems to be in good health, unquote. Backhouse stayed at the Austrian legation for a couple years until December 1941, when World War II reached a new phase. Now, for sure, all British had to escape or else face becoming an enemy alien. All this time, Backhouse had been receiving his allowance from his family, but that no longer became possible, so he was more hard up than ever. But an old guy like Backhouse wasn't particularly important to the Japanese, and for the most part, he was left alone. He moved on to a room at the British legation compound. The following year, Backhouse, who came from a long line of Quakers, embraced the Catholic faith. And it was right around this time that Backhouse met his final collaborator, Reinhard Herpely. We discussed him at the opening of Part 1. For the last couple years of Backhouse's life, he sort of took on the mantle of Backhouse's caregiver, so to speak. Herpely was a doctor, so he was able to monitor Backhouse's health and, do the kind of things a physician does. But he was also a companion who stayed with Backhouse during these very violent times. There's an old story about how when Herpely first saw Backhouse passing by in his rickshaw, he asked his driver, who was that European guy who just passed? And the driver whispered to him that this man was once the Empress Dowager's secret lover. And supposedly from this story, Herpely, now the Swiss honorary consul in Beijing, coaxed the whole story out of Backhouse that he had held inside for all these years. Herpely was actually ecstatic. He wrote about his chance meeting with Backhouse and that now he was, quote, in contact with Sir Edmund, who, having moved for many years in a vanished world, brilliant in art and literature, and at an extraordinary Oriental court, could, in his conversation, bring all back so colorful and vivid that the historical persons whom he had once met seemed alive and spoke through him, unquote. All these amazing stories Backhouse had. Herpely insisted he must write them all down and preserve them for posterity. And so, after a little financial enticement, Backhouse agreed in the hospital to write his memoirs, and Herpely became his editor and collaborator. And sure enough, in May of 1943, the first volume of the memoirs of Edmund Backhouse were ready, 150,000 words, and this was Decadence Monshou. This was the famous obscene memoir of his days mixing with the Manchu court and of his torrid and salacious sexual relationship with the Empress Dowager Cixi from 1902 to 1908. By now, Backhouse had moved into his final residence, a private room at St. Michel's Hospital, located inside the legation quarter, a French Catholic institution run by nuns and administered by the French embassy. There, in that hospital, he ran into the French consul general from Shanghai, visiting Beijing for some matter, Monsieur Roland de Margerie. De Margerie had long known of Backhouse from reading his book, so he was delighted to meet such a character as this. He wrote of meeting Backhouse, quote, I found him very frail, but well cared for. He greeted me warmly on account of my own early days in Peking, and also, but less warmly, because I had known his brothers, the distinguished admirals, in England. He was an impressive figure, with a long white beard, very much a man of letters, and he showed real pleasure as he told me about his literary friendships when young in Paris with Wilde, Verlaine, and Mallarmé. Need I tell you that I was fascinated, especially when, by questioning him, I obtained a promise of further installments. He then told me that he had even known Rimbaud at the time of his liaison with Verlaine, and gave me details on that subject. Unpublished eyewitness testimony on Rimbaud and Verlaine, found in Peking. That was something to turn the head of any lover of poetry. In particular, he was obsessed with homosexuality and recounted his own experiences with relish. The assurance with which he spoke and the extreme dignity of his appearance were in perfect contrast with his known morals, of which he boasted freely. I revisited him several times, but he became visibly weaker. His memoir, Decadence Monshou, was followed by a second memoir entitled The Dead Past. This one concerned his early life before he moved to China in 1898. Like the China memoir, it's chock full of sex and other matters that Herpley knew the world of the 1940s was not ready for. In this second memoir, Backhouse ranted relentlessly on all those from his early days who he despised. Quite a bit of venom in the words contained in this work. Sir Edmund Backhouse died in his bed on January 8th, 1944. He was 70. He was buried in the Catholic cemetery of Jialan, not too far from the grave of Matteo Ricci, Adam Schall von Bell, and Ferdinand Verbiest, who I all featured in CHP episode 98. Backhouse's will was dated February 11th, 1943. Everything he had, he left to his servants and to his relatives back in England. When he died, he had in his possession some worn clothes, an old Victorian traveling clock, and a few books. In his will, Backhouse wrote of his good friend who cared for him in his last years, quote, "To Reinhard Herpely, Consul of Switzerland, my deepest gratitude for the unfailing kindness, patronage, goodwill, which he had so freely accorded, and which is beyond my power adequately to acknowledge," unquote. So Backhouse died, and Herpley put these two memoirs away for another day. He was probably correct in thinking 1944 was not the right time to publish something like this. So Herpley put it in a safe place until 1973, when just before he died, in his attempt to preserve the history, he contacted Hugh Trevor Roper to examine the original and annotated manuscripts that Herpley had kept locked away for almost 30 years. Hugh Trevor Roper said of these memoirs, quote, "I was able to satisfy myself that the memoirs were not merely erroneous here and there, not merely colored by imagination and detail, but pure fantasy throughout. And yet fantasy that was spun with extraordinary ingenuity around and in between true facts that accurately remembered or cunningly bent to sustain it," unquote. He further called the two memoirs a, quote, "pornographic novelette, a last explosion of repressed and distorted sexuality." By the way, I read Trevor Roper was a well-known homophobe, so this might explain why he was so disgusted with the gay side of Backhouse. In Decadence Monshou, Backhouse told the story of his torrid relationship with the Empress Dowager ever since August of 1904, when the Grand Eunuch Li Lianying called on him and told him Cixi requested his presence at the palace. And for the rest of the book, it's a non-stop sexual romp around the Forbidden City, with Backhouse recalling all his homosexual relations with all the eunuchs there and his needing to rise to the occasion to satisfy Cixi's oft-requested command performances. Not all of Decadence Manchu is porn. Plenty of other stuff in there to titillate you. For example, Backhouse recounted the deaths of the Guangxu Emperor and Cixi like you've never heard them before. In 2008, tests were done that determined the Guangxu Emperor died of arsenic poisoning, so the way Backhouse described it, it just couldn't be true. Backhouse also recounts in the memoir how he came into possession of Li Lianying's diary. Upon the death of Cixi, Li Lianying was certain that Yuan Shikai, now the most powerful man in China, had it out for him and was going to have him executed. So Li Lianying, in his effort to preserve his name for posterity, handed his diaries over to Backhouse with the instructions to hold off for a decade before revealing them to the world. Backhouse assured the Grand Eunuch he would do so, but there were never any Li Lianying diaries, and no one ever saw them. Hugh Trevor Roper summed up Backhouse this way, Backhouse was, quote, the spendthrift aesthete of the 1890s who became a sinologist and recluse of the next century, the spiritual fascist of the Second World War, the brilliant linguist who used his gifts to diddle successive patrons, the enchanter whose spells softened the hard heads of businessmen and diplomats, the collector whose generosity enriched his old university, and who inexplicably abandoned his old papers to meaningless destruction, the secret wartime agent who led his own government on a ludicrous wild goose chase, the scholar who created a masterpiece of historical writing and produced a masterpiece of forgery, the ghostwriter who created a whole world of ghosts, the mystery man, the calligrapher, the pornographer. However he may be judged, he was, in his self-expression, an original. Unquote. When Earnshaw Books published Decadence Monshou in 2011, Hugh Trevor Roper had already been dead for 8 years. He had established his name and reputation in his 1947 work, The Last Days of Hitler. His career sort of went down the toilet in 1983 when he, like Duivendeck all those years before, declared these Hitler diaries that had been found authentic. Later, they were found to be a forgery. So his reputation got a little mud on it, and some thought this lack of judgment might also reflect on the credibility of his Backhouse biography. Derek Sandhouse calls Hermit of Peking credible, but he parted ways with Trevor Roper on several points. One of the main ones involved how the Hermit of Peking author didn't bother to try and obtain evidence from Manchu or Chinese sources who knew of Backhouse. He seemed to have made up his mind about Backhouse as the fraud and scoundrel. Derek Sandhouse is a little more open-minded about Backhouse the person, and even though it probably never happened, it's not as outrageous a story as you think, the possibility that Backhouse may have had a sexual relationship with Cixi. Backhouse, in his foreword to the reader, opens Decadence Monshou this way. I, Sir Edmund Trelawney Backhouse, a baronet of the United Kingdom, do hereby positively affirm on my honor and on that of my respectable family, which has played a not negligible part in English public life, that the studies which I have endeavored to write for Dr. Herpley contain nothing but the truth, the whole truth, and the absolute truth. Nothing has been added to embellish the facts, but dates owing to the loss of my records cannot always be accurately given. My intercourse with Cixi started in 1902 and continued till her death. I had kept an unusually close record of my secret association with the Empress and with others, possessing notes and messages written to me by Her Majesty, but had the misfortune to lose all these manuscripts and papers, thereto relating, largely through the cowardice of my domestics and the treachery of people in whom I trusted, so that my large collection of books and documents were lost in toto. That is, excepting for a few dictionaries and handbooks of a linguistic nature, which, however, contain no notes on the secret, not to say erotic, matters whereof I have written. Unquote. Here Backhouse writes of the death of the Guangxu emperor. Quote, the emperor was reclining on the Kang, reading the novel Jinping Mei. Electric light had for some time been installed in the lake palaces. Cui said, quote, Your Majesty, we are respectfully conveying to you our congratulations. We have a decree from the Empress Dowager. Please go on your knees to receive it. Here Guangxu's faithful body servant, the eunuch Zhu Weishou, interposed. Quote, the emperor shall not kneel to a piece of paper. Let Her Majesty come herself at a reasonable hour of the day. Cui answered, quote, our business will not wait. Either leave us alone here or prepare for the inevitable hour. Zhu moved slightly to shield the emperor, and the eunuch Mao shot him dead. Why the sentries did not intervene was due to orders. Then Cui read out the Vermilion Decree, adding, Your Majesty had best shang diao, meaning hang himself. We have a silken rope with us, and will give you a loyal send-off to heaven. Never, said Guangxu. I always knew the Empress meant to have my life. My reign has been one long agony. I only ask, who is my successor? Lun Beizi replied Cui. You shall inform the Empress of my last wish. Let her put Yuan Shikai to death. He betrayed me, and will betray my successor as well, as the Empress herself, sooner or later. Then the two murderers, Cui, Mao, and the Campares, pressed the resisting but feeble emperor down on the Kang. according to Cui's own account to me, which differed slightly from Li Lianying's narrative, partially strangled him with the slipknot, then suffocated him slowly with pillows. And according to this excerpt from Decadence Monshou, that was that for the poor old Guangxu emperor, and no truer words were ever spoken by him than when he said, "My reign has been one long agony." As for the death of the Empress Dowager Cixi, this is how Backhouse described her violent end. Yuan Shikai and Tieliang asked Her Majesty to grant them a special private audience to submit their humble views on a matter of state. The Empress graciously acceded, and they knelt before her. Yuan kowtowed thrice, and Tie followed his example. "Your Majesty is full of years, riches, and honors. You pass your remaining years in the profound seclusion of Yiheyuan, and not to be troubled by multitudinous state affairs. I ask your Majesty," and Tieliang, who nodded assent, joins me in prayer, "to give one more decree, announcing your irrevocable abdication and appointing us as grand imperial preceptors, who will advise the new emperor on all government business as joint regents." The old Buddha's wrath kindled even as thunder. She shouted in her rage and fury, "You traitor! Nay, you traitors! After all I have done for you, is this the way you repay my benevolence? I dismiss you both from your offices and shall order that you be handed for trial to the Minister of Justice. Though you die 1,000 deaths, your retribution will be too light. The cup of your treason and iniquity is full to the brim. Leave the presence and await my orders." Feng Shan, who was in the side hall, and Tieliang, who was kneeling before the throne, agree in saying that Yuan thereupon drew out a 6-chambered revolver and fired 3 shots at the Empress. She did not collapse on the instant, but shouted, "Treason! Arrest Yuan and decapitate him! Unnatural villain! Why have I spared him so long?" So not all of Decadence Manchu is graphic obscenity. Parts of it make great reading. The writing style is a real trip, and Backhouse sprinkles Latin, French, and Chinese everywhere throughout the book. If you're interested, you could get it on Amazon. Sterling Seagrave, in his biography on Cixi, Dragon Lady, the Life and Legend of the Last Empress of China, published in 1992, said of Backhouse, quote, "Whatever his quirks or perversities, Edmund was a born storyteller who found his métier unexpectedly in imperial China on the eve of revolution, slyly mingling pornography and journalism like a child stirring night soil for fertilizer. Throughout his life, he seemed to experience exquisite satisfaction in relating mischievous tales of Cixi's feminine perversity to anyone who would listen. In his days in Peking, he would embroider upon a scandalous tidbit picked up from the Mingshi and float the rumor with Morrison and others. The gossip would percolate through the legations, gaining widespread acceptance. Edmund would then corroborate and enlarge upon his rumor with the discovery of new, quote, facts. He became fascinated by the Chinese tradition of secret pornographic histories and biographies and began collecting them to stir into his repertoire. As he became more proficient with Chinese materials, he produced phony, quote, official documentation, diaries and memorials, critiqued his own counterfeit sources, pointed out the flaws in other theories, and led his credulous audience to the inescapable conclusion that only Backhouse was correct, unquote. As for Backhouse's memoir, Decadence Monshou, Seagrave summed it up this way. Quote, "The extravagance of this wanton sexual burlesque with the dowager and the grotesque details of their encounters make it painfully apparent that they are inflamed sexual fantasy of a mind completely unhinged. What began many decades earlier as ingenious, mischievous satire disguised as history, now degenerated into lunatic graffiti," unquote. Yongchang, or Zhang Rong, the author of Wild Swans and a highly critical biography of Mao, wrote about Backhouse in her recent book, Empress Dowager Cixi, the concubine who launched modern China. Unlike Sterling Seagrave's Cixi bio, Zhang Rong hardly mentions Backhouse at all. He merely got a mention in a footnote where Zhang Rong wrote, quote, "Backhouse has since been exposed as a literary forger. In this case, what he seems to have done was to fake 5 passages about Cixi and insert them into a well-known published diary by a Beijing official named Wu Kedu. As Backhouse published his biography, first in English, the 5 false passages melt into the English translation of the diary he quoted. When his book was then translated into Chinese, the forged passages, thus laundered, became part of the diary. The fake has puzzled historians, as the editions of the diary that exist in China contain no such references to Cixi. Over the years, a lot of you have requested Cixi as a CHP topic, and I assure you, when I made the initial list back in 2010, she was one of the first names I wrote down. We'll get to her one of these days. You sure got an earful in today's episode, didn't you? And with that, we'll end our little 3-part overview of the life of Sir Edmund Backhouse. Again, the books I invite you to read are The Hermit of Peking by Hugh Trevor Roper and Decadence Monshou, edited by Derek Sandhouse. As you know, this year, 2014, marks 100 years since the start of World War I. I wanted to let you know about a new podcast that I found particularly good. Check out Tom Tacken's World War I podcast called The First World War in 261 Weeks. The podcast will feature a story per week introducing all the characters from this period. 261 weeks. That's the amount of time between Sarajevo and Versailles. So go check that out wherever fine history podcasts are distributed, or at the website, www.thefirstworldwarin261weeks.com. Also, I'd like to let you know about author Susan Barker's new book. If you're like me and you can't get enough historical fiction in your life, her new one is called The Incarnations, and it's published by Doubleday. It's a modern-day story that weaves in and out of 1,000 years of Chinese history. I haven't read it yet, but it's near the top of my queue. Right now, I'm reading an earlier work of Susan Barker's called The Orientalist and the Ghost. Very enjoyable. The Incarnations. You might have heard the book recommended on Sinica recently during the Sin and Vice episode with Robert Foyle Hunwick. I'm going to be taking some time off to work on the next series, so it may be a month or so before we meet again. If you're desperate for news and updates, you can always follow me on the China History Podcast Facebook page. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from sunny and beautiful Claremont, California, on the outer edges of L.A. County. Take care, everyone, and I hope your summer's going fantastic. Join me next time, won't you, for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.